The German Shepherd was digging up Thomas Bennett's past, one bone at a time. Thomas stood on his cabin porch in the Oregon Cascades, watching the massive dog work with methodical precision in the spot where morning light filtered through ancient Douglas firs. For 3 months since he'd found the animal half dead on his property, the dog had been the perfect companion, calm, obedient, grateful for the second chance at life. Until this morning, when something had triggered a memory buried deeper than instinct. "Rex, leave it," Thomas called, but the German Shepherd ignored him completely. This wasn't like Rex. The dog had been military trained. That much was obvious from his disciplined behavior and response to commands. But whoever had trained him was either dead or had given up looking, because no one had come searching for 100-pound purebred with distinctive white markings on his chest. Thomas had been grateful for the company. At 61, he carried the weight of 35 years in the Army Rangers like a stone in his chest. The Oregon wilderness was supposed to be his sanctuary, a place where the ghosts of Afghanistan couldn't follow him across 8,000 miles and 20 years of trying to forget. Rex's digging had intensified, his powerful claws throwing dirt and pine needles in precise arcs behind him. There was something purposeful about his movements, as if he knew exactly what he was looking for. Thomas descended the porch steps, his arthritic knees protesting the sudden movement. The morning air carried the scent of pine sap and damp earth, underlaid with something that made his veteran instincts prick with unease. "What have you found, boy?" he asked, kneeling beside the increasingly frantic animal. Rex's response was to dig faster, his breathing becoming labored with exertion. Whatever was down there, it was important enough to drive the normally disciplined dog to ignore direct commands. Thomas had learned to trust animal instincts during his years in combat. Dogs could smell fear, detect explosives, and sense dangers that human senses missed entirely. If Rex was this determined to uncover something, it was worth investigating. "All right, move aside," Thomas said, gently pushing the dog away from the hole. What Rex had uncovered made Thomas's blood run cold. A human finger bone, yellowed with age but unmistakably real, protruded from the dark soil like an accusation. Around it, Thomas could see the edges of what looked like fabric, the remains of clothing that had been buried long enough to partially decompose. Thomas rocked back on his heels, his mind racing through implications he didn't want to consider. Someone was buried on his property, and Rex had found them with the precision of a cadaver dog. But Rex wasn't trained for cadaver work. His military bearing suggested explosive detection or patrol duties, not recovery operations. So why had he been drawn to this particular spot with such urgent determination? The answer came to Thomas with sickening clarity as he noticed something else protruding from the grave. A tarnished dog tag, green with age but still readable. SGT Michael Torres, U.S. Army. Thomas's hands trembled as he brushed dirt from the metal tag. The name meant nothing to him, but the unit designation made his chest tighten with recognition. 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, his old unit, from back when the world was simpler and enemies wore uniforms. Rex was whining now, a low sound of distress that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. The dog was staring at the partially exposed remains with an intensity that suggested more than professional interest. This was personal. Thomas's phone had no signal this deep in the mountains, but his satellite radio could reach emergency services if needed. The question was whether he wanted to involve authorities in something that was clearly more complicated than the simple missing person case. A ranger buried in secret on property that Thomas had owned for only 3 years. A military dog who had somehow known exactly where to dig. And the growing certainty that Rex hadn't found this grave by accident. He'd been searching for it. "You knew him, didn't you?" Thomas asked softly. Rex's response was to lie down beside the grave, his massive head resting on his paws in a posture of profound mourning. It was the behavior of a dog grieving for his fallen handler. Thomas stood slowly, his mind cataloging the tactical situation with automatic precision. If Rex had belonged to Sergeant Torres, then the dog had been living wild for however long Torres had been dead. The fact that Rex had survived and eventually found his way to Thomas's property suggested either incredible luck or careful planning. Neither option was particularly comforting. Thomas walked back to his cabin, leaving Rex to maintain his vigil beside the grave. Inside, he unlocked the gun safe that held his service weapon and the secure radio he'd kept from his final deployment. Old habits died hard, and even in retirement, Thomas maintained equipment that could reach his former unit in case of emergency. This qualified. He powered up the radio and found the frequency for Ranger Command at Fort Benning. It took several attempts to reach someone with sufficient clearance, but finally a familiar voice crackled through the static. "This is Colonel Martinez. Thomas, is that you?" "Yes, sir. I need information on a Sergeant Michael Torres, 2nd Battalion, 75th Rangers, and I need it off the books." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Thomas to wonder if the connection had been lost. When Martinez finally responded, his voice carried a weight that Thomas recognized from their worst days in Afghanistan. "Thomas, where are you calling from?" "My property in Oregon. Sir, I found what appears to be Torres's remains, along with a dog that I believe was his partner." Another silence then. "Thomas, I need you to listen carefully. Do not contact local authorities. Do not discuss this with anyone else. I'm sending a team to your location." "Sir, what's going on?" "Sergeant Torres was killed in action 3 years ago in Syria. Officially, but his body was never recovered, and his dog went missing during the same operation." Thomas felt the familiar cold weight of classified information settling in his stomach. Unofficially, Torres discovered something that certain people didn't want discovered. His death was supposed to look like enemy action, but we suspected it was something else entirely. Rex's barking from outside made Thomas move to the window. The dog was standing over the grave, his body rigid with alertness as he stared into the forest surrounding the cabin. "Sir, I think we may have company." "Thomas, get to cover and stay there. My team is 40 minutes out, but you might not have 40 minutes." Through the window, Thomas could see movement in the tree lane, dark figures advancing with the disciplined coordination of professional soldiers. Rex's barking had become a continuous snarl of warning, his hackles raised in preparation for a fight. "Colonel, whoever killed Torres knows I found the body." "Thomas, Torres was investigating a conspiracy within our own command structure. If he buried evidence with his body, there are people who will kill to keep it buried." The first gunshot shattered Thomas's kitchen window, and Rex's barking turned into the aggressive snarl of a combat-trained animal engaging hostile forces. Thomas dropped the radio and grabbed his rifle from the gun safe. 3 years of peaceful retirement had just ended with the same violence that had defined his entire adult life. But this time, he wasn't fighting in some distant desert for abstract concepts of freedom and democracy. This time, he was fighting for the truth about a dead ranger and the dog who had spent 3 years searching for justice. Rex's howl echoed through the Oregon mountains, a sound of grief and rage that had been building since the day his handler was murdered. Thomas Bennett had thought his war was over. He was wrong. The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving Thomas and Rex in a silence that felt more dangerous than the shooting. Thomas pressed his back against the cabin wall, rifle ready, watching Rex's body language for clues about their attackers' positions. The German shepherd had gone completely still, his ears swiveling to track sounds that Thomas couldn't detect. "Easy, boy," Thomas whispered. "Let me know what you're hearing." Rex's response was to move toward the front door with predatory grace, his nose working to process scents that carried information about the man in the forest. After a moment, the dog looked back at Thomas with an expression that was unmistakably communicative. "They're gone. For now." Thomas didn't trust it. Professional soldiers didn't open fire and then retreat without achieving their objective. Either they'd been testing his defenses, or they were repositioning for a more coordinated assault. His satellite radio crackled back to life. Colonel Martinez's voice was tight with urgency. "Thomas, report your status." "Taking fire from unknown hostiles. They've withdrawn, but I don't think we're clear." "Copy. My team is 20 minutes out. Do not leave your defensive position." But Rex had other ideas. The dog was scratching at the front door with urgent insistence, his whines carrying a note of desperate communication. Thomas understood. Rex wanted to return to Torres's grave, and there was something there that couldn't wait for backup to arrive. "Martinez, the dog wants to show me something at the burial site. I think Torres left evidence with his body." "Negative, Thomas. Too dangerous." Thomas looked at Rex, whose amber eyes held intelligence that bordered on human. The dog had survived 3 years in the wilderness, had somehow found his way to the one person who might be able to help him complete his mission. "Sir, if Torres died protecting classified information, Rex might be the only one who knows where to find it." The silence on the radio stretched long enough for Thomas to make his decision. He opened the front door and followed Rex into the Oregon morning, trusting his life to the instincts of a dog who had already died once for the truth. Rex led him directly to the grave, but instead of returning to his morning posture, the dog began digging again with renewed urgency. This time, he was working at a different angle, uncovering something that had been deliberately placed rather than accidentally buried. Thomas knelt beside Rex and helped clear away the dirt and debris. What they revealed made his hands shake with the implications. A waterproof case, military issue, buried carefully beside Torres's body. Inside were documents, photographs, and a digital storage device that Thomas recognized as a field-hardened drive designed to survive combat conditions. The photographs showed meetings between high-ranking military officers and men in civilian clothes. Meetings that appeared to be taking place in locations that weren't official government facilities. Thomas recognized some of the uniforms as Rangers, Special Forces, Delta operators. Men he'd served with, men he trusted. The documents were worse. Financial records showing payments to overseas accounts, shipping manifests for weapons that should have been destroyed, and orders for operations that weren't part of any official mission profile. Torres had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Special Operations Command. Rex's warning growl made Thomas look up from the documents. The dog was staring at something in the forest. His body language shifted back into combat mode. This time, the approaching figure wasn't trying to hide. A woman in her 40s emerged from the tree line, wearing civilian outdoor gear, but moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. She held her hands visible and empty, but Thomas noticed the bulge of a concealed weapon under her jacket. "Sergeant Major Bennett," she called out. "My name is Sarah Chun, Defense Intelligence Agency. I need to talk to you about Sergeant Torres." Rex's reaction was immediate and unexpected. Instead of maintaining his defensive posture, the dog's tail began to wag slightly. He recognized this woman. "Agent Chun," Thomas replied, keeping his rifle ready but not aimed directly at her. "Convenient timing." "I've been tracking Rex for 3 years," she said, continuing her slow approach. "Ever since he disappeared from a classified site where Torres was killed." Thomas glanced at Rex, whose body language suggested he trusted this woman but remained alert for threats. "You knew Torres was buried here." "I suspected." Rex was trained for more than standard military operations. He was part of a classified program that taught dogs to remember and return to specific locations. When Torres realized he was in danger, he programmed Rex to find this place if something happened to him. The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. Rex wasn't just Torres's partner. He was his insurance policy. Torres knew he was close to exposing something big enough to get him killed. He trained Rex to find someone who could be trusted with the evidence, someone with the military background to understand what it meant and the integrity to see it through. Thomas looked around at his isolated cabin, at the grave that had remained hidden for 3 years, at the dog who had spent that time searching for the right person to help him complete his mission. Why me? I'm nobody special. Sarah Chen's expression softened slightly. Because Torres researched you before he died. Your service record, your reputation, your psychological profile. He knew that if Rex could find you, you'd do the right thing regardless of the personal cost. Rex moved to Thomas's side, pressing against his leg in a gesture that was both affectionate and protective. The dog had chosen him, had led armed men to his peaceful retirement, had turned his quiet life into a battleground. And somehow, Thomas wasn't angry about it. "What's on the storage device?" he asked. "Evidence of a black market operation run by senior military officers. They've been selling weapons to hostile governments, eliminating soldiers who got too close to the truth, and using classified military resources for personal profit." Thomas's radio crackled with Colonel Martinez's voice. "Thomas, we have eyes on your position. There are hostiles moving through the forest around your cabin." Sarah Chen's hand moved toward her weapon. "Those are my people." Rex's bark exploded through the morning air. Not a warning this time, but a call to battle. The dog had spotted something in the forest that represented an immediate threat. Thomas saw them a moment later, 6 figures in military gear, moving with tactical precision toward the cabin. But these weren't legitimate soldiers. Their equipment was too varied, their formations too loose. "Mercenaries," Sarah said grimly. "The people Torres was investigating don't use official military assets for cleanup operations." The first shots came from multiple directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault designed to eliminate everyone at the gravesite. Thomas rolled behind a fallen log, pulling Sarah down beside him, while Rex sprinted toward the nearest attacker with lethal intent. "Chun," Thomas shouted over the gunfire. "How do we get this evidence to people who can act on it?" "We stay alive long enough for your backup to arrive," she replied, returning fire with practiced accuracy. Rex's attack on the lead mercenary created enough chaos to give Thomas and Sarah a tactical advantage, but they were still outnumbered and outgunned. The dog's military training was evident in the way he moved between targets, disrupting their coordination and forcing them to divide their attention. Thomas's rifle spoke with the authority of decades of combat experience, each shot placed with precision born of muscle memory and survival instinct. Beside him, Sarah fought with the cool professionalism of an intelligence operative who had seen action in places that didn't officially exist. But it was Rex who turned the tide of the battle. The German shepherd moved through the mercenaries like a force of nature, not just attacking but coordinating his movements with his human partners in a way that suggested telepathic communication. When Colonel Martinez's helicopter finally appeared overhead, the mercenaries who were still alive chose retreat over certain death. Thomas stood in the sudden silence, looking at the scattered evidence of Torres's murder and the dog who had spent 3 years seeking justice. "Rex," he said softly, "your mission's not over yet, is it?" The German shepherd's response was to pick up one of the photographs from Torres's evidence cache, a picture showing a meeting between military officers and foreign operatives. Rex was telling him that the men who had killed his handler were still out there, still dangerous, still needing to be stopped. The classified debriefing facility in Portland looked like an abandoned warehouse from the outside, but the interior revealed technology that most government agencies could only dream of accessing. Thomas sat across from Agent Sarah Chun at a steel table, while Rex lay beside them. The dog's attention focused on a laptop displaying encrypted files from Torres's storage device. 3 days had passed since the firefight at the cabin, and each new piece of evidence painted a picture of corruption that reached into the Pentagon itself. Torres was more than a whistleblower, Sarah explained, scrolling through financial records that showed millions of dollars flowing through offshore accounts. He was building a case that could bring down a network of senior officers who've been selling American military secrets for over a decade. Thomas studied surveillance photographs showing his former colleagues in clandestine meetings with foreign operatives, names he recognized, faces he trusted, men he'd served beside in the worst conditions imaginable. How did Torres get this close without being detected? Thomas asked. Because he had help from someone inside the conspiracy, Sarah replied. Someone who fed him information while maintaining their cover. Rex suddenly stood up, his ears alert to something only he could hear. The dog moved to the laptop and began pawing at the keyboard with deliberate precision. What's he doing? Thomas asked. Sarah's eyes widened as Rex's actions triggered a hidden partition in Torres's files. He's accessing a voice message. Torres programmed Rex to activate it only when specific conditions were met. The speakers crackled to life, and Sergeant Michael Torres's voice filled the room, calm, professional, carrying the weight of a man who knew he was recording his own obituary. If you're hearing this, it means Rex found someone he trusts to finish what I started. My name is Michael Torres, and I'm about to expose Operation Nightfall, a conspiracy that's been operating within Special Operations Command for 12 years. Thomas felt his chest tighten. Operation Nightfall had been classified above his clearance level, but he'd heard whispers about black budget programs that operated without congressional oversight. Torres's voice continued. The man coordinating the conspiracy is Colonel James Crawford, currently assigned to Pentagon Special Projects. He's been using classified military operations as cover for arms dealing, assassination contracts, and intelligence sales to hostile governments. Sarah was taking notes rapidly, but Thomas was focused on Rex's behavior. The dog was staring at the laptop with an intensity that suggested he understood every word of his dead handler's message. Crawford has corrupted at least 15 senior officers across multiple commands. They use legitimate military operations to transport illegal weapons, eliminate inconvenient witnesses, and test experimental weapons on unauthorized targets. The recording paused, and Thomas could hear background noise, footsteps, voices, the sound of someone approaching Torres's position. I don't have much time. Rex, if you're listening to this, the evidence you need is hidden where we practice the emergency extraction protocol. You know the place. Rex's bark was sharp and urgent, his tail wagging with the excitement of finally receiving clear mission orders from his dead handler. Sarah, Torres's voice said, if you're with Rex, it means my contingency plan worked. The USB drive hidden at the extraction site contains enough evidence to expose the entire network, but you'll need to recover it before Crawford realizes what Rex has led you to. The recording ended with the sound of gunfire and Torres's final words. Rex, complete the mission. Find someone you trust and complete the mission. Thomas looked at the German shepherd, whose amber eyes held the weight of 3 years of carrying that final command. Rex had found someone he trusted, had led him to the evidence, and now expected Thomas to help him complete what Torres had died trying to accomplish. Where's the extraction site? Sarah asked. Rex was already moving toward the door, his body language indicating urgent need to travel. The dog knew where they needed to go, and he was ready to lead them there. Wait, Thomas said. If Crawford is still active, if he's got people inside the military hierarchy, then recovering this evidence is going to be extremely dangerous. Sarah's expression was grim. Thomas, Crawford's people have already tried to kill you twice. They're not going to stop until Rex and everyone who's seen Torres's evidence is dead. Thomas thought about his peaceful cabin in Oregon, about the quiet retirement he'd planned to spend fishing and reading and forgetting about wars. Rex's arrival had destroyed all of that, had pulled him back into a world of classified operations and deadly conspiracies. But as he looked at the dog's determined expression, Thomas realized he didn't want his old life back. For the first time in 20 years, he had a mission that meant something beyond survival. "Rex," he said, "show us where Torres hid the evidence." The German shepherd's response was immediate and decisive. He moved to a map of the Pacific Northwest that Sarah had spread on the table and placed his paw on a specific location, a remote area of the Olympic National Forest, where Special Forces units conducted classified training exercises. "Mount Storm," Sarah said, recognizing the coordinates. "That's a restricted military training area. If Torres had evidence there, it means he knew Crawford's people would never think to look for it in their own backyard." Thomas studied the topographical map, noting the challenging terrain and limited access routes. It's a 3-day hike through some of the most difficult wilderness in Washington. And if Crawford has people watching military training areas, then we go in quietly, Sarah said. "No official support, no backup, no communication with outside agencies until we have the evidence in hand." Rex barked once, a sound of approval and determination. The dog had been waiting 3 years for this moment, and he wasn't going to let concerns about danger or difficulty delay his mission any longer. Thomas made his decision. "When do we leave?" "Tonight," Sarah replied. "Crawford's people will be monitoring official channels, looking for any indication that we're moving on the evidence. If we go dark and move fast, we might be able to reach the site before they realize what we're doing." Thomas gathered his gear while Sarah coordinated with her DIA contacts for equipment and transportation. Rex supervised everything with the focused attention of a dog who understood that his handler's final mission was finally moving into its active phase. As they prepared to leave Portland, Thomas's satellite phone rang with an incoming call from Colonel Martinez. "Thomas, we have a problem. Colonel Crawford has issued official orders for your arrest. He's claiming you're involved in the theft of classified materials and the murder of a Defense Intelligence Agency operative." Thomas felt his blood run cold. "What operative?" "Sarah Chun. According to Crawford's report, she was found dead at your cabin 3 days ago." Thomas looked at Sarah, who was standing 3 feet away, very much alive and preparing for their mission to Mount Storm. "Sir," Thomas said carefully, "I think Colonel Crawford might be operating with faulty intelligence." "Thomas, where are you right now?" Thomas ended the call without answering. If Crawford was claiming Sarah was dead, it meant he was setting up a narrative that would justify eliminating both of them when they tried to recover Torres's evidence. "Sarah," Thomas said, "according to official records, you're dead." Her response was a grim smile. "Then I guess we don't officially exist. That might actually work in our favor." Rex barked impatiently, his mission instincts overriding any concern about the political complications they were facing. The dog had spent 3 years waiting for this moment, and he wasn't going to let bureaucratic maneuvering delay justice for his fallen handler. Thomas shouldered his pack and checked his weapons one final time. He was about to hike into restricted wilderness with a supposedly dead intelligence agent and a dog, carrying a 3-year-old grudge against some of the most dangerous men in the American military. It was either the stupidest thing he'd ever done, or the most important. Rex's confident stride toward the door suggested it was definitely the latter. The Olympic wilderness consumed them like a living thing, closing around their small team with walls of ancient cedar and Douglas fir that seemed to stretch endlessly toward a gray Washington sky. Thomas moved point, his old ranger training guiding them along game trails that wouldn't appear on any military map. Behind him, Sarah Chen maintained the silent professionalism of an intelligence operative who had learned to become invisible in hostile territory. Rex ranged ahead, the German shepherd's nose working constantly to process information that human senses couldn't detect. They'd been hiking for 18 hours, pushing through terrain that would challenge experienced mountaineers. But Rex's urgency was infectious. The dog knew they were close to completing his handler's final mission, and he pressed forward with the determination of an animal who had been carrying this burden for 3 years. "Movement ahead," Sarah whispered, her hand moving instinctively toward her sidearm. Thomas dropped to one knee, scanning the forest through his rifle scope. What he saw made his blood run cold. Military personnel in full combat gear, positioned in a defensive perimeter around something deeper in the trees. Crawford's people. Sarah asked. "No, Thomas Grimley. Those are legitimate soldiers. Rangers, probably from the 2nd Battalion. Same unit Torres served with." Rex's low growl suggested he recognized the uniforms as well. But instead of showing aggression toward the soldiers, the dog's body language indicated confusion and distress. Thomas understood. These were Rex's people, soldiers from his old unit. But they were positioned between him and his handler's hidden evidence. The dog couldn't complete his mission without going through men he'd been trained to trust and protect. "They're not the enemy," Thomas said quietly. "They're just following orders from someone they believe is legitimate." Sarah was studying the soldiers' positions through binoculars. 6-man team, standard perimeter watch. They're guarding something, but they're not expecting trouble from this direction. Thomas made a tactical decision that went against every instinct he developed during 3 decades of military service. "I'm going to talk to them." "Thomas, that's suicide. Crawford probably told them you're a terrorist or a traitor." "Maybe. But those soldiers down there served with Torres. If I can make them understand what really happened to him, they might be willing to help instead of hinder." Rex seemed to approve of this plan. The dog's tail wagged slightly, and he began moving toward the soldier's position with the confident stride of an animal returning to his pack. Thomas followed, keeping his rifle slung but ready, trusting his life to the hope that honor and loyalty meant more than official orders. "U.S. Army Rangers," he called out as they approached the perimeter. "This is retired Sergeant Major Thomas Bennett, requesting permission to approach." The response was immediate and professional. 6 rifles swung toward him, but the soldiers maintained fire discipline, waiting for orders from their team leader. "Sergeant Major Bennett," a young lieutenant called back. "You're ordered to surrender immediately for questioning regarding the death of Sergeant Michael Torres." Thomas kept walking, his hands visible but his bearing radiating the authority of 3 decades in uniform. Rex trotted beside him, and the sight of the missing military working dog caused obvious confusion among the Rangers. "Lieutenant, what's your name?" Thomas asked. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, sir, and I'm ordering you to stop and surrender." Thomas stopped 20 feet from the nearest soldier, close enough to see the doubt in young eyes that had been told he was a dangerous criminal. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, the dog beside me is Rex, Sergeant Torres' partner. He's been missing for 3 years, and he led me here because he has something to show you about what really happened to his handler." Rex chose that moment to demonstrate his intelligence and training. The dog moved to Lieutenant Rodriguez and sat at attention, then performed a series of hand signals that Thomas recognized as military identification protocols. "Where did you find him?" Rodriguez asked, his weapon lowering slightly. "He found me," Thomas replied, "on my property in Oregon, where someone had buried Sergeant Torres 3 years ago." The words hit the Rangers like a physical blow. Thomas could see the impact on their faces. Torres had been their friend, their teammate, and they'd been told he died heroically in combat. "Sir," Rodriguez said carefully, "Colonel Crawford briefed us that Torres was killed by enemy action in Syria." "Colonel Crawford lied," Thomas said simply. "Torres was murdered because he discovered that Crawford was selling military secrets to foreign governments." Rex barked once, a sharp sound that drew everyone's attention to something he detected in the forest. The dog's body language shifted into high alert, his nose working to process a scent that carried information about approaching danger. "Incoming hostiles," Sarah warned from her concealed position. "Multiple contacts moving fast." The sound of helicopters approaching from the south confirmed Thomas's worst fears. Crawford's people had tracked them to Mount Storm, and they were coming in force. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," Thomas said urgently, "in about 2 minutes, armed men are going to arrive here with orders to kill everyone who's seen evidence of Crawford's crimes. That includes you and your team." Rodriguez's expression shifted from confusion to alarm as the helicopter sounds grew louder. "Sir, those should be our extraction birds." "Check your radio frequencies," Sarah called out, emerging from cover with her weapon ready. "See if they're responding to your authentication codes." Rodriguez tried to raise the incoming aircraft on military frequencies, but received no response. The helicopters were military aircraft, but they weren't communicating with legitimate command channels. "Those aren't our birds," Rodriguez said grimly. Thomas looked at the 6 Rangers, at Rex, whose mission was so close to completion, and at the evidence cache that Torres had died protecting. Crawford's people were minutes away from eliminating everyone who could expose the conspiracy. "Lieutenant, I need you to make a choice. You can follow Crawford's orders and help him cover up the murder of one of your own soldiers, or you can help me complete the mission that Torres died trying to finish." Rex moved to the spot where Torres had hidden his evidence, a carefully concealed cache built into a natural depression beneath a massive cedar tree. The dog began digging with urgent precision, his actions making it clear that this was what they'd come to find. Rodriguez watched Rex work, and Thomas could see the moment when loyalty to a fallen comrade overcame official orders. "What do you need us to do?" Rodriguez asked. The first helicopter appeared over the tree line, and Thomas could see armed figures preparing to rappel down ropes. These weren't soldiers conducting a legitimate military operation. They were mercenaries hired to eliminate witnesses. "Rex, show them," Thomas said. The German Shepherd's digging revealed a waterproof container filled with documents, photographs, and digital storage devices. Evidence that Torres had gathered over months of investigation. Proof of crimes that reached into the highest levels of military command. Lieutenant Rodriguez opened one of the files, and his face went pale as he recognized the scope of the conspiracy. "My God, this is treason. This is why Torres died," Thomas said, "and it's why Crawford wants all of us dead." The helicopters were landing now, disgorging mercenaries who moved with professional efficiency toward their position. Rex barked a warning as the assault teams formed up for their attack. "Lieutenant," Thomas said, "your men have a choice. Fight beside me to expose the truth about Torres's murder, or die here protecting Crawford's secrets." Rodriguez looked at his Rangers, all young soldiers who had served with Torres and respected him as a mentor and friend. Their decision was unanimous. "Rangers," Rodriguez called out, "we're fighting to protect evidence of Sergeant Torres's murder. These are not legitimate U.S. military forces. Engage at will." Rex's howl echoed through the Olympic wilderness as the battle began, a sound of grief and rage that had been building for 3 years, finally finding expression in the fight for justice that his handler had died trying to win. Thomas Bennett had thought his war was over, but some wars don't end until justice is served, and some missions don't complete until the truth is told. Rex's mission was finally entering its final phase. The firefight in the Olympic wilderness lasted 17 minutes and changed the course of American military history. Thomas pressed himself against the massive cedar tree that sheltered Torres's evidence cache, returning fire at mercenaries who moved through the forest with the precision of elite operators. Beside him, Rex had positioned himself to guard the recovered documents, the dog's body language radiating protective intensity. Lieutenant Rodriguez and his Rangers had taken defensive positions that maximized their tactical advantage, but they were still outnumbered 3-1 by Crawford's hired killers. "Bennett," Rodriguez called over the gunfire, "how many people know about this evidence?" "Just us," Thomas replied, putting 2 rounds center mass into a mercenary who had tried to flank their position. "If we don't make it out, Crawford's conspiracy dies with us. Sarah Chun appeared at Thomas's shoulder, having worked her way through the forest to join the main defensive position. I've been monitoring their communications. They have orders to eliminate all witnesses and destroy the evidence. Rex's sudden bark drew Thomas's attention to movement in the tree line above their position. More mercenaries were rappelling down from helicopters, preparing to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Rodriguez, Thomas shouted. We need to move. They're surrounding us. But the young lieutenant's response surprised him. Negative, Sergeant Major. We hold this position. Lieutenant, this isn't a sustainable defense. We'll be overrun in minutes. Rodriguez's smile was grim but determined. Maybe, but Rangers don't abandon their fallen brothers. Thomas understood. This wasn't just about military tactics anymore. It was about honor, about completing a mission that had cost Torres's life, about ensuring that a good soldier's sacrifice meant something. Rex seemed to sense the shift in their situation. The dog abandoned his protective position over the evidence and moved to Thomas's side, pressing against his leg in a gesture of absolute trust and partnership. All right, boy, Thomas said, scratching behind Rex's ears. Your handler would be proud. The assault came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm their defenses through superior firepower and numbers. But Crawford's mercenaries had made one critical error. They'd underestimated the fighting capability of U.S. Army Rangers, defending a position they refused to abandon. Thomas's rifle spoke with the authority of 3 decades of combat experience, each shot placed with precision born of muscle memory and survival instinct. Rodriguez and his Rangers fought with the disciplined ferocity of soldiers who had been betrayed by their own command structure. Rex moved through the battle like a force of nature, not just attacking enemies, but coordinating his movements with the human defenders in a way that suggested telepathic communication. The dog's military training was evident in every action. He disrupted enemy formations, protected wounded Rangers, and maintained communication between scattered defensive positions. But it was Sarah Chun who turned the tide of the battle. Using skills learned in classified operations that officially didn't exist, she worked her way behind enemy lines and began eliminating mercenaries with the quiet efficiency of a professional assassin. When the gunfire finally stopped, 7 of Crawford's mercenaries were dead and the rest had retreated to their helicopters. Rodriguez had taken a bullet through the shoulder, but he was still functional. One of his Rangers was down with a leg wound that would require medical attention. Is everyone still breathing? Thomas asked, conducting a quick tactical assessment of their situation. We're good, Rodriguez replied, wincing as Sarah applied a field dressing to his shoulder wound. But this isn't over. Crawford will send more people. Rex had returned to the evidence cache, his nose working to ensure that all of Torres's hidden materials had been recovered. The dog's behavior suggested there was something else, something they hadn't found yet. What is it, Rex? Thomas asked. The German shepherd's response was to dig deeper into the cache site, his claws working to uncover something that had been buried beneath the documents. What he revealed made Thomas's heart race. A satellite communication device, military grade, still functional after 3 years of concealment. Torres had hidden a way to transmit his evidence directly to people who could act on it. Sarah, Thomas said, can you operate this equipment? Defense Intelligence Agency cross-training, she replied, already examining the device's controls. Give me 5 minutes to establish a secure connection. But Rex's warning growl indicated they didn't have 5 minutes. The dog was staring at the sky, his ears tracking the sound of approaching aircraft. More helicopters, Rodriguez said grimly, and these sound bigger. Thomas studied the approaching aircraft through his binoculars and felt his stomach drop. Those are Apache gunships. Crawford's not playing games anymore. The implications were staggering. Crawford was willing to use official U.S. military assets to eliminate witnesses to his crimes. which meant the conspiracy reached higher than Thomas had imagined. "Sarah, how long to transmit the evidence?" Thomas asked. 2 minutes for upload, maybe 3. "Rodriguez, can your man hold position for 3 minutes against Apache gunships?" The lieutenant's response was to chamber a round in his rifle and smile. "Sergeant Major, we're Rangers. We can hold position until hell freezes over if that's what the mission requires." Rex barked once, a sound of approval and determination. The dog understood that they were committed now, that there was no retreat from this final stand. Thomas positioned himself where he could provide covering fire for Sarah while she worked with the communication equipment. Rex took up a guard position that allowed him to monitor all approaches to their defensive perimeter. The Apache gunships appeared over the tree line like mechanical vultures, their weapon systems already locked onto the Rangers' position. Thomas could see the pilots through their cockpit windows, legitimate military personnel who believed they were engaging terrorist targets. "All stations, this is Colonel Crawford," a voice announced over military frequencies. "You are ordered to eliminate all hostiles at the designated coordinates. No survivors." Rodriguez grabbed his radio. "Apache flight, this is Lieutenant Rodriguez, 2nd Battalion Rangers. We are U.S. military personnel defending a classified position. Do not engage." The response came back in Crawford's voice. "Lieutenant Rodriguez has been compromised. All units at those coordinates are hostile. Engage immediately." Thomas watched the lead Apache's weapon systems come online, knowing they had seconds before 30mm cannon rounds turned their position into a crater. "Sarah," he called out, "please tell me that transmission is ready." Her response was the sound of the satellite device activating, sending Torres's evidence directly to Defense Intelligence Agency headquarters, the FBI, and congressional oversight committees. "Evidence transmitted," Sarah announced. "Torres's mission is complete." Rex's response was a howl that echoed through the Olympic wilderness, a sound of grief and triumph that seemed to carry the weight of 3 years of carrying his handler's final command. The Apache gunships opened fire, but their targets were no longer there. Rodriguez and his Rangers had completed their mission and withdrawn to positions that offered concealment from aerial assault. Thomas looked at Rex, whose amber eyes now held the peace of a soldier whose duty had been fulfilled. Torres's evidence was in the hands of people who could act on it. Crawford's conspiracy was exposed, and justice would finally be served. The dog had completed his mission. His handler's death had meaning, and Thomas Bennett had found something he'd been searching for without knowing it. A purpose worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. Rex pressed against his leg, and Thomas could swear the dog was smiling. The safe house in Seattle looked like a suburban family home, but the basement had been converted into a command center that could coordinate military operations across 3 time zones. Thomas sat beside Rex in a room filled with computer screens and secure communication equipment, watching as the evidence Torres died protecting began to dismantle a conspiracy that had operated for over a decade. 3 weeks had passed since the firefight at Mount Storm, and each day brought new revelations about the scope of Crawford's criminal network. 23 arrests so far, Sarachin reported, scrolling through updates from Defense Intelligence Agency field teams. Crawford himself is in federal custody, along with 14 other senior officers from across Special Operations Command. Thomas studied surveillance footage showing military officers being led away in handcuffs from bases around the world. Names he recognized, faces he'd trusted, men whose betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound he'd received in combat. Rex lay at Thomas's feet, the German shepherd's demeanor notably different since completing his handler's mission. The urgent desperation that had driven him for 3 years was gone, replaced by a calm satisfaction that spoke of duty fulfilled. "How is Lieutenant Rodriguez recovering?" Thomas asked. "Full recovery expected," Sarah replied. "He and his Rangers are being debriefed by congressional investigators. Their testimony about Crawford's use of military assets against U.S. personnel is going to result in some major policy changes. Thomas's satellite phone rang with an incoming call from Colonel Martinez. The conversation that followed would change everything he thought he knew about Torres's murder and Rex's 3-year mission. "Thomas," Martinez said, "we've recovered more evidence from Crawford's personal files. There's something about Torres's death that you need to know." "What kind of something?" Torres wasn't just investigating Crawford's arms-dealing operation. He was working undercover for Defense Intelligence Agency, gathering evidence for a federal task force that had been tracking the conspiracy for 2 years. Thomas felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting into a new configuration. Torres was a federal agent. Torres was still a ranger, but he'd been recruited by DIA to infiltrate Crawford's network. His murder wasn't just about silencing a whistleblower. It was about eliminating a federal investigator who had gotten too close to exposing the entire operation. Rex's ears perked up at the mention of his handler's name, and the dog moved closer to Thomas, as if sensing the emotional weight of the conversation. "Sir, does this change anything about the prosecution of Crawford's people?" "It changes everything," Martinez replied. Torres wasn't just a murder victim. He was a federal agent killed in the line of duty. The charges against Crawford just escalated from military crimes to assassination of a federal officer. Thomas looked at Rex, whose amber eyes held the same intelligence and loyalty that had driven him to seek justice for 3 years. The dog had known his handler was something special, had understood that completing the mission was worth any sacrifice. "Colonel, there's something else." Rex wasn't just Torres's partner. He was part of the federal investigation. He was trained to recover evidence if something happened to Torres. The silence on the phone stretched long enough for Thomas to wonder if the connection had been lost. When Martinez finally responded, his voice carried the weight of official recognition. "Thomas, Rex is going to receive a commendation for service to the United States. What that dog accomplished, finding Torres's body, leading investigators to the evidence, completing his handler's mission, it's unprecedented in military history." Thomas scratched behind Rex's ears, feeling the solid warmth of an animal whose loyalty had changed the course of American military justice. "Sir, Rex did what any good soldier would do. He completed his mission and brought his people home." Sarah was monitoring news feeds on multiple screens, tracking the public reaction to the Crawford scandal. "This is going international," she said. "Congressional hearings, Pentagon investigations, allied governments demanding explanations about compromised operations." But Thomas's attention was focused on Rex, who had moved to the window overlooking the Seattle skyline. The dog's body language suggested he was processing something, making a decision about what came next. "Sarah," Thomas said, "what happens to Rex now? Officially, he's still military property." "Actually, he's not," she replied, pulling up a file on her computer. Torres's DIA contract included provisions for Rex's care and disposition. If Torres was killed in the line of duty, Rex was to be retired and placed with someone Torres designated as trustworthy. Thomas felt his heart rate increase. Who did Torres designate? Sarah's smile was answer enough. According to the paperwork Torres filed before his final mission, Rex was to be placed with a retired ranger who lived in Oregon and had demonstrated the kind of integrity that would ensure the dog's well-being. Rex barked once, a sound of satisfaction and approval. The dog had not only completed his handler's mission, he'd also found his way to the person Torres had chosen to be his new partner. Thomas looked at the German shepherd who had turned his peaceful retirement into the most important mission of his life. "Rex, you've been planning this for 3 years, haven't you?" The dog's response was to press against Thomas's leg in a gesture of absolute trust and partnership. Thomas's phone rang again, this time with a call from Pentagon personnel. The conversation revealed another dimension of Torres's planning that left Thomas speechless. Sergeant Major Bennett, the Pentagon official said, we're calling to offer you a position with Defense Intelligence Agency. Your work with Agent Chun and the evidence recovery operation demonstrates exactly the kind of experience and integrity we need for our new internal security division. Thomas looked around the command center, at Sarah coordinating with federal investigators, at Rex, whose mission had sparked the largest military corruption investigation in decades. What kind of position? Thomas asked. You'd be leading a team responsible for investigating suspected corruption within military special operations. The Torres case proved that we need people who can't be compromised, who will pursue the truth regardless of how high the conspiracy reaches. Thomas thought about his cabin in Oregon, about the quiet retirement he'd planned to spend reading and fishing and forgetting about wars. Rex's arrival had destroyed that life completely. But as he looked at the dog whose loyalty had exposed a conspiracy that threatened the integrity of the entire American military, Thomas realized he didn't want his old life back. When do I start? He asked. Rex's tail thumped against the floor, and Thomas could swear the dog was smiling. Sarah Chun looked up from her computer screens with an expression of satisfaction. Thomas, I hope you realize what you're getting into. This team is going to make a lot of enemies. Thomas knelt beside Rex, looking into amber eyes that held the wisdom of a soldier who had completed an impossible mission through sheer determination and loyalty. Sarah, Thomas said, I've got the best partner in the business. I think we can handle whatever comes next. Rex barked once, sharp and decisive. The dog was ready for their next mission. Thomas Bennett had thought his military career was over, that his war was finished. But some missions don't end. They just evolve into something more important. And some partnerships are strong enough to change the world. 6 months after exposing the Crawford conspiracy, Thomas Bennett stood in a Pentagon conference room that didn't officially exist, briefing a team of investigators whose identities were classified above most senior officers' clearance levels. Rex lay beside the conference table, the German Shepherd's presence lending an air of calm authority to proceedings that would reshape military intelligence operations for decades to come. The dog wore a new collar, one that identified him as a federal investigator rather than simple military property. Operation Nightfall resulted in $2.3 billion in illegal arms sales over 12 years. Thomas reported to the assembled officials, we've recovered evidence of 47 unauthorized missions, 18 assassinations of military personnel, and direct collaboration with hostile foreign governments. Sarah Chun added financial details from her position at the head of the table. Crawford's network laundered money through defense contractors in 17 countries. We're still discovering the full scope of the economic damage. But Thomas's attention was divided. Rex's behavior had changed over the past week. The dog was showing signs of the same focused attention that had preceded his discovery of Torres's grave. Something was triggering the animal's investigative instincts. Agent Bennett, General Patricia Morrison said, using Thomas's new DIA title, your recommendations for preventing similar conspiracies? Thomas looked at Rex, whose amber eyes held intelligence that had proven more valuable than any human asset. We need investigators who can't be compromised by personal ambition or political pressure. People and animals whose loyalty is to the mission rather than the hierarchy. Rex stood up suddenly, his ears alert to something only he could detect. The dog moved to the conference room's secure communication console and began the pawing behavior that Thomas now recognized as a signal for hidden information. What's he detecting? Sarah asked. Thomas examined the console more closely and found what Rex had identified, a data port that wasn't part of the original equipment configuration. Someone had installed unauthorized hardware in one of the Pentagon's most secure facilities. General Morrison, Thomas said grimly, we have a security breach. The implications were staggering. If Crawford's network had penetrated the Pentagon deeply enough to install surveillance equipment in classified briefing rooms. Then the conspiracy was larger than they'd imagined. Rex's continued investigation of the console revealed something even more disturbing. The device was actively transmitting, sending real-time intelligence about their anti-corruption operations to unknown recipients. "Sarah, can you trace the transmission?" Thomas asked. "Already on it," she replied, connecting her laptop to the Pentagon's secure network. "The signal is encrypted, but Rex's discovery gives us access to the source code." General Morrison was coordinating with Pentagon security, while Thomas studied Rex's behavior. The dog wasn't just alerting to the surveillance device. He was tracking something else, some pattern or connection that human investigators had missed. "Rex, what else do you see?" Thomas asked. The German Shepherd's response was to move to a specific section of the conference room wall and begin his familiar scratching behavior. Behind the false panel he revealed was a cache of documents that made Thomas's blood run cold. Financial records showing payments to offshore accounts, communication logs detailing coordination between Crawford's people and foreign intelligence services, and most damning of all, a list of active military personnel who were still working for the conspiracy. "The network is still operational," Thomas said, scanning names he recognized from current special operations commands. Crawford was just the visible leadership. The real conspirators are still embedded in the system. Rex barked once, sharp and urgent, then moved to the secure phone that connected the conference room to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The dog's body language indicated immediate danger. Thomas understood. Someone in the Pentagon senior leadership was part of the conspiracy, and they now knew that Thomas's team had discovered the continued operation. "General Morrison," Thomas said urgently, "we need to evacuate this facility immediately. Our investigation has been compromised." But Morrison's response revealed the true scope of their problem. "Agent Bennett, I'm afraid that's not possible. This meeting was specifically designed to identify how much you know about our ongoing operations." Thomas felt the familiar cold weight of betrayal settling in his stomach. General Morrison wasn't just briefing Pentagon leadership about their investigation. She was reporting to the conspiracy itself. Rex's growl filled the conference room, the dog's instincts recognizing Morrison as a threat long before Thomas's human senses caught up. "Sarah," Thomas said quietly, "how long to download those files?" 2 minutes, she replied, her fingers flying over her keyboard while maintaining eye contact with Morrison. "General, you're going to let us walk out of here," Thomas said, his hand moving toward his sidearm. Morrison's smile was cold and professional. "Agent Bennett, you're in the Pentagon. Even if you could escape this room, you'd never make it to the parking garage." Rex's response was to position himself between Thomas and Morrison, the dog's military training evident in his tactical assessment of the threat. But Thomas had learned to trust Rex's instincts completely. If the dog thought they could escape, then there was a way out that human perception couldn't detect. "Rex, show me," Thomas said. The German Shepherd moved to what appeared to be a solid wall and began pawing at a section that looked identical to the rest of the room's construction. His actions revealed a hidden access panel that opened into a maintenance corridor. "How did you know about that?" Morrison asked, her professional composure cracking slightly. "Torres programmed him with Pentagon security information," Thomas replied. "Every escape route, every hidden passage, every weakness in the building's design." Sarah finished downloading the files and grabbed her equipment. "Thomas, we need to move. Security teams are mobilizing throughout the building." They slipped into the maintenance corridor just as armed personnel began surrounding the conference room. Rex led the way through passages that bypassed the Pentagon's main security checkpoints, his knowledge of the building's hidden infrastructure proving invaluable. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked as they navigated through service tunnels that most Pentagon personnel didn't know existed. Rex's destination became clear as they emerged in the Pentagon's underground parking garage. The dog had led them to Thomas's vehicle, where escape was possible if they moved quickly enough. But as they reached the car, Thomas realized they were walking into another trap. The parking garage was filled with armed personnel, wearing the uniforms of legitimate Pentagon security. But their positions and coordination suggested they were taking orders from Morrison's conspiracy. "Thomas," Sarah said, "we're surrounded." Rex's response was to bark in a specific pattern. 3 short barks, 2 long ones, repeated continuously. Thomas recognized it as a military distress signal, but he couldn't understand who the dog was calling for help. The answer came from overhead in the form of helicopter rotors cutting through the air. But this wasn't Pentagon security responding to Rex's signal. The aircraft that descended toward the parking garage bore the markings of the FBI's Critical Incident Response Group, and the agents who rappelled down were people Thomas recognized from congressional hearings about the Crawford investigation. "Agent Bennett," the FBI team leader called out, "we've been monitoring your investigation. Are you secure?" Thomas looked at Rex, whose tail was wagging with the satisfaction of a job well done. The dog had somehow coordinated their rescue while navigating through the Pentagon's hidden passages. "How did you know to come here?" Thomas asked. "Your partner activated a distress beacon," the FBI agent replied, pointing to Rex's collar. "Federal investigators working on sensitive cases get priority response." General Morrison and her security team found themselves surrounded by federal agents with arrest warrants signed by federal judges. The conspiracy that had murdered Torres and corrupted military operations for over a decade was finally being dismantled at its source. As Thomas and Sarah were escorted to safety, Rex maintained his alert posture until every member of Morrison's team was in federal custody. "Rex," Thomas said as they waited for transportation, "you've been planning this for a long time, haven't you?" The German shepherd's response was to press against Thomas's leg in a gesture of absolute trust and partnership. Torres had programmed Rex not just to expose one conspiracy, but to systematically identify and eliminate corruption wherever it existed in the military hierarchy. The dog's mission was far from over, and Thomas was beginning to understand that his new career would be defined by following Rex's instincts into the darkest corners of military intelligence. 2 years after the Pentagon conspiracy was exposed, Thomas Bennett stood in a cemetery in Arlington where white headstones stretched endlessly under an October sky that threatened rain. Rex sat beside him at Sergeant Michael Torres's grave, the German shepherd's bearing reflecting the solemn dignity of a soldier paying respects to his fallen handler. The headstone bore Torres's name, rank, and service dates, but nothing about the classified mission that had cost him his life or the 3-year quest for justice that had followed. "He would have been proud of what you accomplished," Thomas said softly, his hand resting on Rex's head. The dog's response was a gentle whine, a sound that carried the weight of memory and loss. Rex understood that they were here to say goodbye, not just to Torres, but to the mission that had defined their partnership for so long. Sarah Chen approached across the manicured grass, her footsteps careful and respectful in the sacred silence of Arlington. She carried a folder containing the final reports from their investigation, documents that would remain classified for decades, but had already changed the structure of American military intelligence. "The last of Morrison's network was arrested this morning," she reported quietly. 43 military personnel, 17 defense contractors, and 6 members of Congress. It's the largest corruption investigation in Pentagon history. Thomas nodded, but his attention remained focused on Rex. The dog had completed the mission Torres had died trying to finish, had exposed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, had proven that loyalty and determination could triumph over systemic corruption. But Rex was also 10 years old now, his muzzle gray with age. his movements showing the first signs of the arthritis that would eventually end his career as an active investigator. "Thomas," Sarah said carefully, "we need to talk about Rex's future." Thomas knew this conversation was coming. Rex had spent 7 years in military service and 3 years seeking justice for his murdered handler. The dog had earned the right to a peaceful retirement, to spend his remaining years as a companion rather than an investigator. But Thomas also knew that Rex's unique abilities had prevented other conspiracies, had saved lives, had protected the integrity of institutions that millions of Americans depended on. The dog's nose could detect corruption with the same precision other dogs use to find explosives or drugs. "What are the options?" Thomas asked. "Full retirement with you," Sarah replied. "A pension, medical care, and the recognition he deserves for his service to the country." Rex's ears perked up at the word retirement, but his attention remained focused on Torres's headstone. The dog seemed to understand that this was a moment of transition, a choice between continuing the mission and accepting the peace he'd earned. Thomas knelt beside Rex, looking into amber eyes that held a decade of loyalty and service. "What do you want, boy? You've done enough. You've completed every mission, solved every case, brought justice for everyone who needed it." Rex's response was to nuzzle Thomas's hand, then stand and walk to a nearby headstone, one that bore the name of another fallen soldier, another life lost to the kind of corruption and betrayal that Rex had spent years fighting. Thomas understood. Rex wasn't ready to retire because the mission wasn't finished. As long as there were soldiers being betrayed by their own commanders, as long as there were conspiracies that threatened the people Rex had sworn to protect, the dog would continue fighting. "Sarah," Thomas said, standing slowly, "Rex has made his choice." "Thomas, he's earned the right to rest." "He's also earned the right to choose his own path," Thomas replied, "and he's choosing to continue serving." Sarah's expression softened with understanding. "Then we make sure he has the support he needs. Lighter duty, regular medical checkups, and a partner who understands what he's been through." Rex barked once, a sound of approval and determination. The dog was ready for whatever came next, as long as he could continue making a difference. Thomas's phone buzzed with an incoming message from Pentagon Intelligence. A new case, a suspected conspiracy involving military contractors and overseas operations. The kind of investigation that would require Rex's unique abilities and Thomas's experience. "Rex," Thomas said, "looks like we have another mission." The German shepherd's tail wagged with the enthusiasm of a dog who had found his life's purpose and wasn't ready to give it up. They walked together across Arlington's hallowed ground, past the graves of heroes who had served with honor and died with dignity. Rex's service had ensured that their sacrifices wouldn't be diminished by the corruption of those who had betrayed their trust. As they reached their vehicle, Thomas looked back at Torres's grave one final time. The debt had been paid, the mission completed, justice served. But Rex's work would continue because some dogs are born to serve, and some partnerships transcend individual missions to become something larger. "Sarah," Thomas said as they prepared to leave, "what's our next assignment?" "Military weapons disappearing from bases in Eastern Europe. Local commanders are claiming terrorist theft, but the pattern suggests inside involvement." Rex's ears perked up with interest, and his body language shifted into the alert focus of a working dog. The German shepherd understood that they were transitioning from one mission to the next, from seeking justice for the past to preventing corruption in the future. Thomas scratched behind Rex's ears one final time before opening the car door. "Ready for another adventure, boy?" Rex's response was to jump into the vehicle with the eager energy of a dog who had found his calling and embraced it completely. As they drove away from Arlington, Thomas reflected on the journey that had begun with a dog digging in an Oregon forest. Rex had lost a handler, but found a partner. Thomas had lost his peaceful retirement, but found a purpose worth living for. Together, they had proven that loyalty, determination, and justice could triumph over the darkest conspiracies. And together, they would continue fighting for the principles that made their service meaningful. Rex pressed against Thomas's arm, a gesture of trust and partnership that needed no words. Some missions end with victory. Others end with the beginning of something even more important. Rex's mission to avenge his fallen handler was complete, but Rex's mission to protect those who serve with honor was just beginning, and Thomas Bennett had finally found the war worth fighting for the rest of his life.